Welcome back to Save the Nation. Is the UK being policed on a two-tier basis? This is the question of the day. It's one to which the government is giving a confused answer. Yet it is a fundamental and ancient constitutional principle that the government speaks with one voice. This is known as collective responsibility. Ministers may not freelance, and what one minister says must be the position of the government, or else the statement must be corrected or the minister resign. Last night, a mob of scores of armed Muslim men swarmed the streets of Birmingham. Here's some of the pictures from Sky News showing these events.
Community leaders have been speaking to the police as well because...
Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
But I think, apologies for the language you're hearing, but a sense of the anger I think you can hear there.
Yeah, Katie, I think Becky...
Remember for a moment that the government speaks with one voice. Jess Phillip, a minister in the Home Office, which is the department responsible for policing, and, has to be said, a thoroughly good egg, had this to say. These people came to this location because it has been spread that racists were coming to attack them. This misinformation was spread entirely to create this content. So is this the government's position on these armed bandits roaming the streets? Do they have no moral responsibility? Do they have no free will? Is Richard Tice somehow responsible for forcing them to run around the streets with weapons? This two-tier double-standard mentality goes right back to Sir Keir's response to the Black Lives Matter riots. Less than 48 hours after a riot culminated in the pulling down of the statue of Edward Colston, which was then dumped into Bristol Harbour, the then leader of the opposition took the knee with Angela Rayner. This was an acceptance that rioting and violence can be justified and that weak, namby-pamby policing is all right. It's also an endorsement of the extreme ideology of critical race theory that was the driving force behind the BLM movement. The Prime Minister needs to confess that he was wrong to take the knee and to endorse the BLM riot. And His Majesty's government's position is that last night's activities by an armed mob in Birmingham were wrong and inexcusable. Otherwise, he is endorsing, he is the proponent of two-tier policing. And the only way to restore order in this country is to ensure that the law is applied equally to all. There's no excuse for rioting in a democratic country that has just had an election. Labour, however much I may not like this, has a mandate to govern, but it cannot pick favourites, must not sympathise with the left-wing rioters, or BLM, or last night in Birmingham. If it does, it will lose the trust of other communities and risk unleashing a form of sectarian disorder that a civilised country cannot allow. As ever, let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. But I'm very pleased to be joined this evening by the political commentator, Andy Williams. And thanks so much for coming in.
Evening.
The taking of the knee was a grave mistake, wasn't it, after the riots had taken place in Bristol?
Well, if you don't mind me saying, Jacob, I think you've made a few logical leaps to get from where we've been over the last week and the taking of the knee and the Black Lives Matter disturbances of a few years ago. I think we're looking at different things. I think we're looking at disorder that stems from different issues. And I don't think that I think the government has been very clear that it's treating all disorder in an equal way.
Okay,
and you mentioned,
okay.
and you did mention Jess Phillips, and she's been very clear in her tweets and in her pronouncements that any act of violence will not be tolerated.
You say different causes for the violence, but that is the prelude to justifying some and not others. That's the problem with taking the knee over BLM, whereas the leader of the opposition, had he been statesmanlike, would have said that if there is a statue you don't approve of, you should campaign through democratic means to have it taken down. Not, I'm taking the knee, I'm supporting these people who have just committed a violent act.
Well, I actually think, as always, there's more that we have in common than that which divides us in these instances. You know, we'd all agree that there are legitimate reasons for people to protest, whether it's as a result of Black Lives Matter or whether it's because people feel strongly about the horrific incident that happened in Southport and everything that stemmed from that. But what we should all agree on is that acts of significant violence must not be tolerated. And what I've seen over the last few days is people seeking to justify some of those acts of violence by saying that people have legitimate concerns. That's what I find dangerous.
Yeah, well, I think that's nonsense. There is no legitimate concern that allows you to riot in a democracy. If you're in a totalitarian regime, there may be, but not in a democracy. And I've got quite a lot of sympathy for Jess, because she's an outspoken, charismatic member of Parliament, and I found that going from the freedom of being a backbencher to the discipline of being a minister isn't particularly easy. You have to bite your tongue. But what she said is these people came to this location because it's been spread that racists were coming to attack them. This misinformation was spread entirely to create this content. That is a defence, a sympathy with people who turned up in masks with weapons. I think that is a mistaken quotation, isn't it? That is, the government needs to make it clear that that is not the position of the government. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't said that's not the position of the government.
I think that is a mistake, because I think, as with, looking at, there have been various people trying to justify different positions that rioters have taken, coming from all sides, and you couldn't possibly know. So I'm agreeing with you. Yeah. You couldn't possibly know where those rioters were coming from in the first place, what their view was, why they were there. And I think there is some inherent justification in that statement, and I think we should just blanket say nobody should be doing this.
I completely agree with you, and Jess is now Home Office Minister when the Home Office is in charge of policing. So it's more serious than if it were said by the Minister for Aviation.
Of course, because it's part of her role. I accept that.
And there is an impression, and it comes from some of the policing around the Palestinian marches and the policing that we've seen now, that there is this two-tier policing. And the Commissioner of the Police getting so bad-tempered yesterday, it's clearly a sore point with him, isn't it?
It is, and look, I'm in my work, I advise CEOs and senior people who lead organisations every single day. And the first thing we would say to anyone in a position of responsibility like that is you cannot respond in a sort of rash or emotional way, regardless of how you feel. He's clearly frustrated, run down, whatever, that's no excuse. But he absolutely shouldn't have responded like that. Nonetheless, I think these accusations of two-tier policing are misplaced. I don't think there's significant evidence for that. And I think if you just look, for example, and it's only one measure, if you look at the number of arrests since Saturday, 147. Look at then the Black Lives Matter protests 4 years ago, 135 over a weekend. It's pretty consistent, actually.
Well, it depends on the numbers in the protest. And
of course it doesn't. It's one measure.
The Black Lives Matter protests were coincident around the time of the Sarah Everard protests, which were extraordinarily heavy-handedly policed. And that's part of the issue. You see, I'm not just trying to take a cheap shot at the government, though I do think that Keir Starmer, as leader of the opposition, set the wrong tone. I think this has been a problem that has been building up and has made people feel that the police take some instances of violence more seriously. And here I think we agree that they should treat them all the same.
Absolutely.
Where we disagree is that you think there's no evidence for two-tier policing, and I think that it is a matter we should be concerned about and that we need proper reassurance from the government and indeed from the police. It's why I think Sir Mark Rayleigh really ought to stand in front of journalists and answer questions, because it's a legitimate question.
Well, I'm always in favour of transparency, and I actually, again, I work in strategic communications. From a communications perspective, I would be in favour of him standing up and saying, come at me, ask me questions, and I think he would be able to change some perceptions if he did that. Now, perception, I think, is the issue here. I think what this comes down to is a crisis of confidence in our institutions, in the police, in the government, and I don't just mean the Labour government, I mean government in general. And that is a huge problem. Now, I don't have the answer to how that is resolved, and it certainly won't be resolved in a day, but I think that is part of the context here.
And part of that is to clarify what Jess Phillips has said and to make it clear that, as I was saying earlier, that I think the Prime Minister should now say, actually, he regrets taking the knee, that would make it clear that he didn't endorse the violence that was going on.
But I think that is misplaced, because I don't think there is a direct causal link to what we're talking about. I understand what you're saying, but what we're talking about today stemmed, the trigger for the last week's worth of protest was this horrific incident in Southport. And we're sort of making leaps and bounds, and now we're talking about BLM, and I don't think it is about BLM or taking the knee.
The one thing we can finish on and agree on is that it is bizarre and wicked as a response to the brutal murder of children to start hitting policemen. Just completely not understandable to any law-abiding citizen.
Absolutely, and I mean, whether it's throwing bricks at policemen or burning down shops or anything like that, this sort of disorder is just awful to see, and it has to stop.
Thank you very much, Andy. Well,